Hello, everyone. As we gather today, I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone involved in organizing this event, my amazing colleagues who are presenting and behind the scenes, our incredible panelists, our host Aiken Gump and their beautiful venue, our funding partners, and all those in attendance virtually and in person, with a special thanks to anyone in the audience with lived experience that are here sharing their expertise with us. A little bit about myself. My name is Erika Lopez, and I'm the Communications Associate for the Law Center. I joined the team in March of this year. I'm currently a student earning my bachelor's degree in journalism and public affairs with aspirations of writing about how economic issues and poverty affect our society. As a child, I experienced housing and food insecurity and homelessness with my mother, bouncing back and forth between living in our car and crashing on living room floors when we could. I remember attending 4 different schools in just 1 grade because my mother was evicted at least as many times that year. These experiences helped shape my interest in studying poverty and the economic systems and decisions that create and perpetuate it. I also sit on the board of a shelter in upstate New York called Joseph's House and Shelter. We offer 100% non-judgmental services across 2 counties, and I was just selected to be the chair of their PR committee. So why are we here today? What do we hope to learn? As media narratives demonizing and exploiting people experiencing homelessness proliferate, our panel will discuss messaging and narrative building around homelessness with a key focus on the importance of elevating the voices of those with lived experience in the media. We will discuss how to effectively engage and leverage the stories of people impacted by homelessness as a tool to shift public perceptions around its root causes and strengthen the arguments for effective solutions. Joining me in conversation today are Mark Horvath of the incredible Invisible People, a media organization that I personally look to for leadership on this subject, and Pam Fessler, a member of our board of directors and a retired NPR correspondent. Can you both please introduce yourselves?
Hi, everybody. I'm Pam Fessler. I worked at NPR for 27 years. I was a reporter for 47 years, and I just retired last year. At NPR, the last 14 years, my beat was poverty issues. And as such, I obviously covered a lot of housing stories, but also homelessness. And I was fortunate because, as many of you know, if you listen to NPR, what we try to do is tell stories, and that we try to address issues by bringing the voices of the people who are affected. And I think that we found, NPR always found that was what resonated most with our listeners. If they could hear the voices that evoked certain issues, emotions, that people felt very connected with those people that they heard about. And through that, we could address a lot of important issues that are facing this country today. So hopefully we can talk more about that and some of the things that I learned and that I think that you all can help apply in your advocacy, what you do.
Hi, I'm Mark Horvath. I'm the founder of Invisible People. I spelled neighbor N-A-B-O-R, so it's really, really whack that I'm a news publisher. Invisible People just started out as me with a camera, started trying to survive the 2008 crash after a period of homelessness and rebuilding my life, and is now, we are a media publisher reaching 10 to 20 million people, sometimes even 100 million people in a 30-day period.
Thank you. I also find it's helpful for me to just point out how nervous I am. It makes me feel a little better for you to know that I am very nervous. We'll get that out of the way. All right, so why is it important for us to center the voices of people with lived experience when we're writing about homelessness? Seems like an obvious question, but I feel like some people need to hear that answer.
Well, I think you're right. It is pretty obvious, but not obvious to people who are not unhoused, or to the broader audience that you're trying to reach. And that is that if you don't have the voices of people who are living through this experience. That allows the people who are setting the narrative to basically demonize people who are homeless. And by telling individual stories, you are humanizing people. You're humanizing them in a way that people who are listening or reading can relate to the experiences and say, okay, this is an issue that I actually need to care about and address. Otherwise, we are, it makes it too easy for people to just kind of say, okay, let's get rid of these people, let's get them out of sight, and then we don't have to worry about it at all. I recently wrote a book, totally unrelated, about leprosy in the United States. And while I was writing the book, I felt that there were many, many parallels to the way we treat homeless individuals and the whole issue of homelessness. That the whole way that this country treated people who had leprosy was to get rid of them, to isolate them, to put them in a leprous area down in part of Louisiana, and it was out of sight, out of mind. And one of the ways they were able to do this is by demonizing those individuals and making them not human beings that we can relate to. And that is why we have to tell the stories of these individual people, that they are not a monolithic group, but these are individual people going through experiences that are not very different from a lot of experiences that everybody else goes through.
To frame this, I think we need to separate it because you have the homeless sector and everyone else. So in the homeless sector, lived experience is now sexy. We have Zoom calls and we have conference sessions about how to engage with lived experience. If you work in the fucking homeless sector, and Paul Bowden told me to rip it out, if you work in the homeless sector and you are not directly connected with homeless people, what is wrong with you? We don't, homeless people, Paul said it yesterday, we've been saying the same shit for 40 years. We need housing, services suck. We need housing, services suck. I'm homeless, help me, right? And nothing changes. Now, the law office does a great job. I know several of the people here that are homeless, and there's organizations that are actually putting people in power. I personally hate the term learned expertise, which is now the new sexy phrase. And they have learned expertise. If we're fucking experts, pay us. If we're fucking experts, listen to us, make change, right? And because like that consultant you consider an expert, you're paying them huge money. But for us, learned expertise changing to learned expert is just a cute phrase. Now for media and outside, I like to highlight Kate Cagle from Spectrum in Los Angeles. She does a marvelous job of bringing in the voice of homeless people to every story she does on homelessness. And I know this is a shock, especially to some people, but good media should be balanced, right? You should tell both points of view and let the public decide. And Kate has an amazing way of leaning it a little bit to favor homeless people by including them. And I think it's so important. The other thing is, we as people, we don't listen to experts. We don't need to hear another CEO or a PhD talk about homeless. People are moved by personal stories. There's actual research that the least responsive or believable to the public is experts. But what do? Here's our CEO. He's going to talk about housing. Here's a PhD researcher. She's going to talk about criminalization. And the public's going, huh? So that is where the voice of homeless people is vital.
Thank you. As a journalist, how do you approach these conversations in a way that makes the interviewee feel safe and heard at the end of the day once you produce what it is that you're producing with them?
I was quite advantaged actually at NPR because they gave me time to spend with the people that I covered and the issues, so that it would take me a while to sort of develop a rapport of trust with the people who I covered, and especially people who were homeless. And I didn't just go out into the streets and just kind of, knock on somebody's tent and say, hey, I'm from NPR, I'm doing a story about homelessness, can you talk to me? Because I don't think that really would have worked very well. So generally, I was able to work with people, activists, people on the street, many of whom were homeless themselves, but who wanted these stories told and were more than happy to work with me. And they would introduce me to other people who were living on the streets or who were experiencing homelessness one way or another. And say, hey, you can trust her, talk to her. And then I would spend a lot of time with people. I mean, a lot of time. I wouldn't just sit down and do an interview and say, how did you get here? What do you experience? What are the problems? I would just follow people through their daily lives. I did a story, and this kind of goes back a little bit to what Mark said, because I was a news organization, we covered the news, right? So a lot of those were originated through data and experts, right? So I think of this story that, there was a lot of research done about the aging of the homeless population and how this presented a whole new range of challenges in dealing with homelessness. Tons of data, right? Tons of data about the aging and people and the medical problems. So I, working through healthcare for the homeless in Baltimore, basically found several different individuals, and I ended up profiling a couple who were older, and I'd spend days with them through their daily routine. And that story was so evocative for our listeners. But it took me a while to kind of get the people's, who I was reporting on, their trust to open up to me. And when you spend time with people, they do. I mean, I got up, I would spend overnight. I walked with them. I went on the bus ride with them because they were on the circulator bus all the time. I was with them when they set up their tent underneath the highway at nighttime, where they kind of found their stash of stuff, where they had to stash it during the day so it wouldn't get stolen. And the final scene in that story was them setting up their tent under a highway in Baltimore in the freezing cold. And the man talked about how his mate, his partner, how she had been released from the hospital recently after gallbladder surgery. And she had to recover in that tent. And he had to change her bandages in the middle all night in this tent, this tiny tent in the freezing cold under a major highway in downtown Baltimore. I got so much response from him just telling that one little story, but we were actually there when he was telling me in the freezing cold. And when I retired from NPR, one of the producers told me that she actually mixed the piece and pulled together the whole piece, that she broke down in tears when she was listening, mixing that story. To me, that was just sort of the best I could hear about. And it's just spending time with people. You're not just parachuting in as a reporter, but actually spending time and listening to them.
Pam brought up a really good point that her editor, your newsroom, allowed you time. Most journalists don't have that. So I'm not saying educating journalists, there's no value. I'm not saying there's no value to outreach to journalists, but make your own noise. Tell your own story. We live in a world now where you can be a news publisher. I have a learning disability. I really choose spell and neighbor, NABOR. And I'm on Google News every single day, Apple News every single day with writers, 17 freelance writers. Many of them are homeless. Some of them are probably watching. I know. Hi. I think we need to look at it from that framing that we're trying to control journalists, and journalists often don't have control of their own story. Yes, in some cities like Seattle, there's a person assigned to the homelessness beat. That's a little different, but most journalists don't. And we also live in a world, I mean, we're reaching now 4 million people a month on TikTok, 6 million on Instagram. We have reached over, gosh, who knows, on YouTube. And that's where people are consuming media. You guys all know Little Nas X, right? You know how he made that? You know how he got Old Town Road? He bought the track for $200 and started making memes, right? He rocked the system and used culture. If we're going to change the narrative of homelessness, we can't do what's been done before. We have to adopt culture and how people communicate today. Prager University puts out 50 pieces of content a week, most of it targeted to young adults. And that's the long game, and they're having significant influence on it. And that's because they're funded $50 million a year, and it's working. As far as people being safe, so on Invisible People, we have protocols. People first. And so I've been thinking about this question a lot. So I'm that guy that you hate in the elevator because I say hello to you. So it has nothing to do with homelessness. And that's a byproduct of me talking to strangers, that I have just changed myself to where I talk to strangers. And if you treat people with respect, they'll respect you back. It has nothing to do with homelessness. Yes, you have people that are hurting. You want to be very conscious of triggering their trauma. You have to be conscious. We're doing a lot of criminalization videos now. You have to be conscious that LAPD is right there and sanitation's putting up a rope just because you got a press pass and they want you not to tell their story. So there's all these things in play that you have to be conscious of. And again, separating into two conversations, Invisible People is a news organization. So news organizations do not get model releases. What I do that's a little different is like Kelly, who's done an Invisible People video. If she told me right now she wants it deleted, I will delete it. She owns the rights to it. And I don't know any other nonprofit that does that. But I put homeless people first. Now, if I'm going to do a mini documentary that's either funded by a foundation or a client or something that we're doing that has to be edited, that we're putting a bunch of money into, and I have to have that homeless person sign a model release, pay them. Pay them. Your writers are getting paid, your photographers are getting paid, your videographers are getting paid, your marketing people are getting paid, and you're going to slip that homeless person a $20 bill for telling their story that you're going to raise money from or do advocacy from. So our bottom line is we pay an actor's day rate for usually about 4 hours that we follow a homeless person around. And we need to change the DNA of how we tell people's stories. And the number one thing, there's so many stories that I would like to tell that just I won't put online. And I have hard drives full of people that have shared their story with me that for whatever reason, if you watched it, it would hurt that person in some way. So I don't upload it. For me, the person is more important than the story. Now, if you're a nonprofit and you have comms people, right, they're pushing for stories. And then if you have programs people, they're saying, oh no, privacy, privacy. That is a healthy tension. You have to have that tension because then you will make sure that you'll do right. Your programs people, if they're not fighting for their clients' privacy, they're not doing their job right. And if your comms people aren't fighting for stories, they're not doing their job right. So it's a little bit of a checks and balance internally. Often organizations fight that tension, but I, from my experience, embrace it because it makes sure that you treat people correctly and that nobody's being exploited.
How can we deal with some of the more insidious and prevalent myths about unhoused people that are circulating in the media? And how can we attempt to counter them without feeding into the negative framing? As an example, we often hear that most unhoused people are addicted to drugs or alcohol. That's a claim that people use all the time. A typical response to that might be someone quoting the actual data points of the actual data points of people who are experiencing homelessness, who struggle with abuse disorders. But I feel that a better response would to reframe the conversation is that housing is a human right and all people deserve shelter, regardless of whatever their individual struggles may be. Anything beyond that is just cruel, especially in a country as wealthy as America. So how can we effectively reframe the conversation around homelessness so that we're not feeding in to the negative narratives that are being proliferated?
So I think it just actually goes right back to what we've been talking about, is you have to tell these stories of real human beings. And do we want to live in a country? I mean, you can talk about the slogan, housing is a human right, and maybe I'll get myself in trouble here, but I'm not sure that that's the most effective thing to a slogan to use.
I knew he was gonna say that.
You know, because it's somewhat jargony in some ways, even though it's short and simple. I mean, I would frame it more. I mean, do we as human beings want any other human being in this country to be living outside in the freezing cold and have nowhere to put their possessions, nowhere to sleep, and nowhere to go to the bathroom? I mean, that's not the country we want. And so we have to do something about it. I mean, and the way that you get at that is by, again, telling these stories of individuals. And I just had a revelation in the last session, which we talked about Cicero, which was great. If I was an assignment editor at NPR right now, the way I would tell that story, I think this John Lonsdale, who opens it, now he's a story. I would tell, here's a man who is a billionaire, who gets his money from private prisons, right? Running private prisons, at least Eric, right? Yep, right.
Yeah.
And also monitor, and he has set off this campaign. So I would do a story about him, and then another story about an individual who has been affected by this policy and the negative impact of that policy. I think one of the things you have to do, and Mark alluded to this, I mean, we are in this, atmosphere where there's so much information. You are competing, when you're trying to tell these stories, you are competing with so much information. You have to come up with new and creative ways to tell these stories. And sometimes it's not just the direct story of an individual, but the people around them. And I would highly recommend that. So I want somebody to do a story about John Lonsdale.
So our Cicero content is some of the most popular. And that's another thing that behind the scenes, like LA Times, which is I live in LA, it's my contact. The reporting on homelessness is some of the least traffic. We want to believe that article on homelessness, everybody's going to read it. Well, Pam said something great. We don't want people being outside. There's others that want homeless people gone. They don't see homeless people as humans. They just want homeless people gone. So housing is a human right as a saying. I love how you're interjecting it into thank you. But as far as the general public, I have not seen success because it comes back to me. And for invisible people, we look at, so our journalism is not necessarily, I'm trying to be a news publisher. I mean, we're a news publisher, but it's not, I'm going to compete with the LA Times and New York Times because I don't have the budget. But in 3 years, when you type homeless into Google, I will be the top on there. It's a long play game. And with all our channels and news, the other thing is I hate sports. I hate sports. It's just not my thing. So if the article is about baseball or Super Bowl, I'm not going to read it. So people that don't have affinity for homelessness are not going to watch a video on homelessness. They're not going to read a story. But that title, because this is how we consume media now, right? And that title, it's vital that you put the key points that you're trying to message in your title and up front in your video or up front in the first paragraph, because people will scan that while they're going. For invisible people, and we have a multi-pronged approach that, for instance, because you brought up mental health, we did an addiction. So we do scripted films. They're short because homelessness is a tough subject. So people are going to have, it's a tough emotional subject. You don't want to keep them there for a long time. You want to make your points and, before they turn off. But so we're doing a film on eviction. It will premiere, the trailer's online. It will premiere December 17th. It's about a Black mother in Vegas getting evicted. And what we're trying to do, the strategy is people think homelessness is an addiction crisis when it's really an eviction crisis. So instead of arguing, oh, here's facts, we produce content that will emotionally change their paradigms. We also do mini documentaries, again, around 17 minutes, 19 minutes. The one that I point out on this topic is we did a mini doc on Dr. King in Venice. And this was targeted, doesn't have a lot of views. You have to target to your audience, and that might be a small group of people. So Venice is one of the most nastiest NIMBYs in this country. And so when we went in with Dr. King, we had a choice, and me and the producer talked about it. If we had avoided the conversation of mental illness and addiction, it would have been dismissed. People would say, no, that's not real. So we hit it head on, but throughout the video, you hear housing as a solution, housing as a solution. I mean, we were spot on honest about addiction and mental illness, but we also messaged housing. And I try to do what is called I dubbed it, the Trojan horse, because the people we want to reach won't watch content on homelessness or read an article on. So I try to do, I have an animation coming out, how to talk to your kids about homelessness. I'm going after parents, and throughout that animation, I'm so psyched because I hired kids and actors and the voices. Oh, it's so good. And throughout the video, we reinforce the paradigms that people need to, change. And so that is invisible people strategy. It's multi, depending on the audience. Sometimes we actually will target a politician like Gavin Newsom with SB 57. And, so there's a lot of different ways, but I recommend everybody here can be a media publisher. You have a phone that can reach billions of people immediately. So I did a little video from my phone of McPherson Square. It will hit 100,000 views by tomorrow. Didn't cost me anything. I control the narrative 100%. So I'm not saying there's no value in journalism because we're a news publisher, but tell your own story, publish your own media, make the truth louder.
Yeah. kind of touched on my next question, actually. Well, yeah, I think you may have answered my next question, which was about how to effectively deal with NIMBYism, because a lot of the times housed people tend to be one of the largest barriers, to solutions to homelessness. So, the question was, how can we address and write about these issues in a way that impacts the hearts and minds of housed people? But you kind of already answered that. If you'd like to address that, you
Yeah,
can.
I guess the only thing I would add, and this is something that Marisol brought up in the earlier session, which this is an emotional debate. I mean, this is not a debate about facts. It's not a debate about, certainly not about numbers, but we are trying to appeal to the way that you change people's minds is by appealing to their emotions. And no?
Yes, I'm trying to,
Okay. And I think that obviously that has got to be the focus. And the question is, how do you best do that? And this is a question I've kind of been grappling with myself, because as a journalist, right, I come from a upper middle class family. I live out in the suburbs, I'm a fairly well-off white woman telling these stories. And I am going at, what's the difference between me telling those stories and then maybe Mark and the people that he works with, right? So I think there's a lot of benefit, obviously, to the way you're telling stories, but I also feel there's some benefit for people like me to be the messenger, because I come at it with oh my God, I can't believe people actually live like this. I can't believe that the stories that people are telling me. So that if you get somebody who is a journalist who can tell those stories, I come at it with probably the perspective that the average American is approaching these issues. And hopefully I can answer those questions or see those things that are going to grab them like they grab me as a reporter. What I would always do when I would spend hours and hours, as I say, or days with tape, I would get, 20 hours of tape for a 6-minute story. And I always would lead with the thing that I came home and told my husband about, the anecdote. Because I thought, if that's the thing that grabs me, then that's the thing that's going to grab the average listener. And it might be something that somebody who's already homeless or unhoused might not even notice, because it's become so much a part of their life. So I think there is some importance and value in having kind of outsiders tell the story. Obviously through the eyes of people who are living this experience. Like I remember one time, this is not so much housing, but it was more poverty. I was up in New York and I was doing a story about a food pantry. And while I was working on the story of the food pantry, I saw some woman. One of the things they were doing, they would let people have rolls of toilet paper. And this was in New York City, so they were from the hotels. Hotels gave the food pantry leftover, unused rolls of toilet paper. How they always put a nice fresh roll in everybody's room. And there was this woman who was just scrounging, and she could only get one roll. And she was just scrounging through them to find the roll that had the most toilet paper. And that just struck me that we live in a country where somebody has to just look so hard to find a little bit of extra toilet paper. And at that time, a friend of mine had because I was in New York for my birthday, had given me a gift certificate for a food emporium in New York. And I had gone there, and I couldn't believe there were like 8,000 kinds of olive oil, and they all cost a fortune. And even though I had a $100 gift certificate, I could get like some pasta and oil, and that was it. And so I did a piece about the contrast of me in New York. This basically 2 New Yorks, that we had these people who could spend $100 on olive oil and pasta, and this woman who was scrounging just to get a little extra toilet paper. Anyway, so that might be something that other people might not have seen, but because it just struck me really in the gut. I did that story, and I think that it actually had some impact on people.
I have a little tag, and you see what she did? She told stories. This is the second one she told. It's really, really good. It's effective. But she told it personally from her. There's a marketing trick, especially when you're trying to persuade people, like attracts like, so address the skeptic. We don't have the budget to effectively execute this, but campaigns like what was the Ireland Gates? Ireland was the first country to support gay marriage. So you address who the NIMBYs are, who the negative are, like could be a middle-aged white woman, right? And you have content of that middle-aged white woman saying, you know, I used to hate homeless people, but I changed my mind. And people see themselves in that and go, wow, okay. So address the skeptic, like attracts like. Trying to reach youth, do you use stories? If you're trying to reach, you know, the first step is polling and research. And the other one that was so important, and I love that the first line is what you told your husband. And we forget about this. We create content that we believe people need to hear, damn it, right? Instead of creating content people want to consume. We're trying to force our message instead of listening to your audience, whoever your audience is, and then providing them value how they want to be messaged, not how we want to be message our message, but how they want to be messaged. And you bringing in your own and is just priceless. I had to talk about that.
Actually, can I add one more
Yes,
thing?
please.
Sorry, I have another story. One of my favorite stories, I did a profile of a man named James Brown in Los Angeles, who he was a veteran and he'd been living on the street most of his adult life. He was being housed under a new program in the city, and I can't remember the details, but I went with him when he moved into his very first apartment. And, you know, I forget my point there. Okay. So he was wonderful. He did this, you know, he was just so charming, and he just was a great story. So I did this story. I get a call from a landlord in Los Angeles after the story aired. And he said, you know, I want you to know that that man you profiled lived in the alcove outside my front door of my, it was an Allstate insurance broker for a year. And he said, and you know, he was one, we kind of had an agreement, like he could live there as long as he cleaned up in the morning, he packed up his stuff and wasn't there when my customers were coming and going. And he said, after he got housed, he sent me a thank you note. And he said, I got this note and it said, dear building owner, I am the man who lived in your alcove for the past year. And I want to thank you very much for letting me do that. Now that I'm housed, I just really appreciate all that you did. And so I talked to the man, James Brown's social worker. I said, this is amazing. And he said, yeah, he wrote a thank you note to every single person and property owner who had allowed him, or maybe inadvertently allowed him, to sleep on his property over the past 15 years. And that story to me so much, you know, it just blew me away. Because I think my sons and my family, my husband wouldn't write a thank you note like that, you know. And this man, you know, and I think that just captured the humanity of this person, and hopefully made other people seem humanized, other people who are in a similar situation. I'm sorry, I had to.
Go your
Yeah.
It actually was kind of a fairly good segue to the next.
I did that to you. Agree?
So if you were in the Cicero session just before this one, then you may have heard the discussion around this, but I thought it would be good to pose it to the rest of the group. camping bans are being framed by organizations like the Cicero Institute as common sense and more humane than allowing unsheltered homeless people to camp in public spaces. For advocates, this is obviously nonsense, but this messaging does seem to be resonating with the broader public. How do we directly and effectively combat this narrative?
This is a tough one. It really is, because, you know, they're lying in a way, but in a way, they're playing off truth. And I know it's a lot bigger issue, but if we were winning at housing, that narrative would go away. So before any other messaging, whatever, we have to fix housing first. We have to bring it to scale. And I get that's not an easy task, right? There's all kinds of challenges to do that, but we're not, that's the only real way to combat that narrative. What's interesting to me is, I mean, I hate that they do it, but it's actually perfect, like what I was saying, because it goes on the person. It's compassionate. I can support locking up homeless people because it's compassionate. It's brilliant messaging. It's just evil. You know what I mean? Locking people up as a compassionate response. But we have to together, the Housing Narrative Lab talked about it, Don talked about it, a couple other people, there's a couple of things. We have to come together, you know, and there was a PowerPoint slide. The guy's presentation was brilliant, except he had one line that said the leading cause of homelessness is mental health. That's from us, right? We have to start telling the same stories, but we have a huge time organizing behind ourselves. Then on top of that, we need to give people something to do. And there's nothing nationally. I literally have an audience of 10 million people or more that I can send to a call to action, and I have nothing to send them to because we can't all get together. Now, when our film Eviction, we're going to start doing the eviction something coming up. And during COVID, we were able to send 14,000 emails to Congress, you know, supporting some of the eviction moratoriums and some of the other benefits. But on this criminalization, and there's nothing, there is nothing. And I get it. You fight homelessness at a local level. There's not much at the local level either. We just created a bunch of great content, anti-sweep content with amazing messaging. I learned so much doing it, but there was nothing for people to do. So I stopped doing it. So all of you, wherever city you are, I will come and produce really kick-ass anti-sweep video content. And I need your help to put it into a call to action and let's kick ass.
I don't know how to follow that up. You know, I guess the one thing I would add is that you just again have to tell the stories again and again of successes, right? How the policy successes, how Housing First has worked and where it has worked, how criminalization has failed, and you have to tell it through individuals. And I go back to, I think you have to talk about the motivation of the people who are pushing these laws too, right? Mm-hmm. Looking at the Cicero Institute, who are they? Who are the politicians who are trying to force this and why? You know, what is the motivation behind?
Put the spotlight back on them.
Right. Yeah. Why are they doing this? And that's where I would focus my attention. I mean, quite frankly, you also have to, you know, address the news. I mean, you have to address there are people, a lot of people in this country who, especially after COVID, you know, they started coming back to their offices and coming downtowns, and they're concerned, like, why are we have all these encampments? You know, I thought homelessness was going down in DC, you know, but now I can see people everywhere, and all my, you know, liberal progressive friends are like, oh, you know, it's terrible. We need to do something about this. And I think you have to address those issues and address those concerns and not kind of ignore them and just say, well, these people are just.
Let me just add on that a little bit. To build trust, you have to have balance. One of the things the homeless sector we're really good at is, look at us, we're ending homelessness. Look at us, we're ending homelessness. Oh my gosh, we got a new 40-unit building. We're ending homelessness. Oh my gosh, look at, and the public sees homelessness growing. And they detach from us. They don't trust us. So with invisible people, we try to share the good and the bad and the ugly. There's actually scientific evidence that when you're storytelling or you're an individual or an organization, when you start being authentic and start saying, I mean, the ideal message is, hey, we're doing better than we ever have. But homelessness is growing. And we can't keep up. And we need your help. Most nonprofits say, hey, we're winning. USICH says they ended homelessness in 84 communities, right? Community Solutions, full disclosure, I'm a consultant. For Community Solutions says they ended homelessness in 14 cities. Which is it? 84 or 14? No wonder the public detaches from us and doesn't trust us. So solutions, stories, solution messaging is important, but we also have to be authentic and be honest about the failures, or people aren't going to trust us. They're not going to trust the solution. That's not easy for nonprofits to do. Nonprofits want to paint themselves as a hero. I mean, I'm literally right now, we're trying to get anybody that's taking somebody from the streets into housing. I will be there and produce a video that will live on a YouTube channel with 100 million subscribers. And I can't find nonprofits to do it because I want to talk about the benefit housing has on the community. I want to talk about systemic crises, and the nonprofit wants their executive director to talk about how they just housed this person. So, you know, we have to change our own DNA on how we tell these stories and how we communicate with the public. Sorry.
Don't apologize. Listen, you guys keep going back and forth.
We met here first. The first time we met was here.
Well, not today.
Not today.
Several years
Yeah.
ago.
This is probably less so a question for Mark and more a question for you. Why so often in legacy media do we see stories being framed from the point of view of business owners and the housed rather than focusing on the stories of the unhoused?
Actually, is that true? I mean, I'm not sure that is 100%
A
true.
lot of the
Yeah.
stories that I read that are flagged for me typically tend to be voicing frustrations on the part of business owners.
Right,
And
right.
yes.
Traffic and ads.
And I think that goes back a little bit to what I was just saying before, is that you have to acknowledge the fact that the story that's going on right now is that Americans at the end, for the most part, at the end of the pandemic, are now more concerned, a lot of people are more concerned about, you know, when they go downtown and they see all the homeless encampments, right? I think that we had a little bit more concern during the pandemic about evictions. And what it means is that you again have to kind of grab the narrative and change the narrative. Go back to focusing on, we still have an incredible housing crisis. We still have mental health crisis. We have all of these issues, and you just have to grab that narrative and change it back.
I guess I'm just wondering if it's a matter of, as Mark was saying, the funding mechanisms and the ads and things like that.
Oh, you for the media.
Yes.
organizations. I mean, it's hard for me to say because I worked for NPR and it didn't really affect it. So I don't know. I you know, and honestly, my sense, and I did work for newspapers and I worked for other publications, and was that generally that really didn't have much impact of what the editorial decisions were made. But that probably is quite an influence on social media and all these sort of non-mainstream media outlets, which people nowadays get tons of it, most of their information from, unfortunately.
Well, I have a friend that, you know, you get bonuses if you get more traffic. So he says he writes 2 posts a week to put his kids through college, and one that he feels has integrity. You know what I mean? And this is just the world we live in. And I just want to add on to this. This is why you have to be a media publisher. We can't control, media is driven. Why Invisible People and NBR, you have a different fundraising strategy. You're member driven, right? We're starting to get a little grant funding, but most of our funding comes from private donations. When the gas prices went up, it takes 67%. So our donations down, and I had to pull back on our content. But what the advantage is we post every day on Apple News, 6 days a week. Saturdays are lived experience. If you got lived experience, you write. We pay for you. We pay for your writing. And we have control of the narrative. And it takes a while. I get it. Your bosses, right? They want a spike. They want to see results. I had 20,000 subscribers on YouTube for 8 years. I now have 1 million subscribers. You just have to keep telling the story. It's a long game. This whole issue with criminalization and housing isn't going away. We have to change our campaign thinking. But all I wanted to say is on this particular topic, media is driven by a lot of outside, Trump controlled the news cycle for a very long time. Right? Something can happen right now and it controls the news cycle. You could have been working with a reporter that's going to do some great thing, and there's a school shooting, and it all just, hits the editing room floor, as they say, right? You have no control over journalism. So write your own stuff, get it up there, make the truth louder. Right now, as we're speaking, hundreds of thousands of negative media content has been shared on social media, broadcast news. The biggest guilty is broadcast news for telling a negative story. And they're hawks on social media. If there's a negative social media video, and they will put it into their broadcast news, amplifying it, right? And then you have Joe Rogan and Dr. Drew, and you have influencers. There was a woman yesterday that talked about influence. We don't even think like that. Right? Yeah, we don't even think like that. I do. I'm working with TikTok on trying to connect with some of them, but we just don't have the bandwidth right now. But that's how you reach new networks and new people. Sorry.
We should apologize.
Because we're doing it wrong and we're losing, and we don't have time. We got to course correct now. We can't wait down the road. We have to jump in and change our narrative, change the narrative now. We can't wait.
And just to add to that, just real quick, I think you talk about a lot of the stories coming from the perspective of businesses, right? So that's the way why you have to change the narrative in that, solving or addressing the issue of homelessness, as you all know, is going to benefit everybody in this country, not just the people who are directly involved. It's going to benefit businesses. It's going to benefit the community. And that's the long-term solution. And if you believe that the long-term solution is housing first, and not criminalization, and not getting rid of encampments or some of the Cicero policies, that's how you address. I mean, so the story is maybe comes from the business perspective, but from the business perspective, solving homelessness or addressing homelessness with long-term solutions is the answer. It helps them too. And you have to get that message across, again, through people and people's stories.
And then one last quick, it all matters. Documentary films matter, the New York Times matter, it all matters. But there's now culture communicates a different way, and we're putting a lot of our resources in outdated communication strategies that don't reach people or have the influence they once did. It depends on targeting. Often a politician will pay attention to a New York Times where somebody else won't. So, you have to look at, you have politicians, you have news media themselves, you have other nonprofits, how we communicate, and then you have the general public. Those are the four primary audiences, and we all interconnect and all different. So this is where I look at philanthropy has an amazing opportunity, because a lot of us are grantees, and they could direct and say, okay, you're really like Diane Yentl is great at politicians. I'm not. Diane Yentl isn't as good as Invisible People at public. I'm good at people. Let's work together.
We've got about 15 minutes left, so I'd like to open it up to any audience questions. So if anyone has a question, if you are in one of the far ends of the room, I can walk over with the microphone for you.
Skip that question.
Which question? The PragerU one?
No, it's fine. I want you to skip it. I've been looking at the clock. I've been looking at the clock.
I skipped my PragerU one because you already answered it.
I had a question with the, you were talking about the sister over, doing a story on the billionaire. Who's funding it, and he owns private prisons. Would you, just as a journalist, would you look at, if you're running a private prison and you're profit driven, and you're gonna make more profit if your prison's filled, would you look at a connection between having vulnerable people that you can easily incarcerate as one of the motivations of why?
I probably would be a little more subtle of that, but definitely in the way I would tell a story, that point would be made, if you know what I mean. And that's why I was saying I actually, just sort of thinking through myself, if I was still at NPR, would do a story maybe about one of the prisons that he owns, and maybe somebody who was homeless was arrested or had a record who had to go to that prison. Just happened to be, coincidence, but I think that that's the way you make it real, right? Nobody in this country knows that this guy who's, that these people, politicians who are talking in these states about trying to pass this legislation to, what they presented as humanely provide, get people off the streets. They don't know it's all being driven by this guy with all this money, and who's getting this money from private prisons, and people should know that. And I think that's a really important story to tell.
And you gave me a great idea. I'm gonna make a TikTok of him as a Bond villain. Because it's Bond villain shit, right? Anytime I tell somebody, I'm like, you're not gonna believe this. It's like Bond villain shit. And, but both are important. An NPR story on the Bond villain and tapping into modern culture with TikTok or IG and all the other social video. And I really am I'm going back to my social media video producer, and we are going to make a Bond villain of this guy.
Yeah, or Disney villain.
A what?
Or a Disney villain.
A Disney villain. It seems more Bond like to me, but different audience.
Would also encourage folks to look into this is beeping or blinking. I don't know if it's low battery or something. But I would encourage other people to look into also Palantir, the company, and what types of investments and work that they do, particularly around racial AI policing. And so the company does a lot of big data evil things. So I would also look into those biases that are being implemented in the system as well.
And so much of what's going on in this country and around the world, it's just power, right? Between moneyed influence and people who don't have money. And so that story, this also tells that story too, the broader story of who's got the power, why, and how they're using it.
That resonates. I was shocked. The Cicero, we've written about them twice, and it's popular on both Apple News and our website. And I was shocked because criminalization usually isn't a popular story. And it was both of them. They skew differently. Believe it or not, Apple News is older. It's 55 and plus, which kind of shocked me, but it's a different audience.
I have a question about how to bridge the divide between people's stated beliefs and their actions. And, I'm talking about those well-meaning people, those good, decent, well-meaning people who will say things like, I believe that housing is a human right. I'm opposed to the criminalization of homelessness. But when there are affordable housing developments near them, well, not here, but somewhere other than here. Or, well, if they're in this part, that's not good, and if they won't move, then I guess we do have to send it to police. How do we deal with this lack of self-awareness and the hypocrisy that a lot of our audiences that are hearing the message and would describe themselves as allies, how do we actually get through to their real selves?
Santa Claus is a little green elf that fought for unions. So Coca-Cola came in and, made him the jolly fat guy that eats cookies after the chimney, right? Diamond rings, we used to be able to ask somebody to marry without having to pay 3 months' salary. That's a De Beers marketing campaign. It changed culture. We are sinking when it comes to support for housing, and we're not going to gain it back until we do a large scale campaign to address exactly what you talked about. I mean, I do what I can with the little funding we can. We reach a huge amount of people. We do a great amount of work, but it's not enough because the negative is being reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. And people already hold on to these beliefs. Those beliefs are deep. They run super deep. So to counter those negative paradigms, the best model we need to look at is like Rick Caruso, who just spent $100 million on Los Angeles campaign, right? I mean, the damage he did about talking about shelter and different things is going to be forever. But he took a lot of money and he blasted his message, and people say he failed. He came really close to winning, right? That model of the political campaign, we first test what messaging will reach people, and then we blast the shit out of it and repeat it over and over. Every time they're online, every time they look at a billboard, every time they see pass a punch bench, every time they see a school lunchbox, that messaging is there, but we're not there yet. The philanthropy has to come behind us to support it. And I mean, all of us, not invisible people.
First of all, that's a great question. And I think, as a journalist, I would say you just have to continue to do those stories that point out that hypocrisy. So you have, say, the example of during COVID, New York City, having unhoused people housing them in the Lucerne Hotel in the Upper West Side, and all the Upper West Side people, very liberal community, freaking out, right? And so, I think then you have to kind of pose the question to the people who live there, saying, well, what is your alternative? What else should be done? You really have to press them on it. And the same thing happened in DC here when, they were the city was trying to have get rid of the family housing homeless shelter and have shelters in all the different wards. And the biggest opposition was in ward, and I don't know what number ward it is, but it's the one in the upper northwest.
Three.
Yeah. Again, incredibly liberal, progressive community. I'm sure everybody there would say, oh, yes, we need to do more to help people who are unhoused, but not here. And I just think you have to keep doing those stories and point out that hypocrisy.
One thing I want to add is mutual aid groups. One thing we forget about, and we think about journalism and we think about social media and TikTok, in person has so much more impact than reading a tweet or a TikTok. So if you can get, one of the reasons we've done several mini docs on mutual aid groups is to get more people to volunteer. So not everybody's going to do that, but people that are on the fence that go out and have, Mike Bonin or somebody was talking about a mom going into a tent, right? You will have so much more impact. So you use it as a strategy. You have this online campaign or journalism opt-out campaign that gets people to go to an in-person event where you nail them, where you change their paradigm. In-person has huge and we don't talk about its potential.
Question right over here. I'm Dr. Mayala. I'm with People for Fairness Coalition. I'm the assistant director, and I'm so happy to meet you guys today. My question was in like extension of the other question, but for us, when we go out to do, per se, like outreach, we went yesterday to McPherson's Square. It's expanding to the point where, like, how do we like change the narrative as to, I think they're trying to clear it out in either February or March. Where are these people going to go? Because pet peeves are full, okay? They saying that they don't have this room. I went over there yesterday. I was able to see that it's not the faculty's issue, like they're not making the issue. The issue is coming in when the person is sent to pet peeve, okay? And they have already exhibited trauma, and the doctor is putting them in a room with a stranger that might add to that trauma. So then by the time the person do get the apartment, they're so traumatized quietly because they're trying to, like, behind closed doors, not tell anybody anything. So when they get to the apartment, it's big, it's large, it's huge. They have nobody there with them. They slide right into the depression, and then they either commit suicide or return to the streets. This is not helping our process when we're trying to get them into housing. But how can you enjoy that housing after when you go to some place and you're being privately experiencing extension of your trauma or tortured or however else, and then you get to that housing, you're at the part you won, you know, you're there, and then you're going back to the street, or then they commit suicide. And we're seeing this process rise so much within the last year. So then when I go to McPherson Park and I meet these people and I talk to them, and they're like, I'm going into pet peeve soon to go to housing. And then we hear these horror stories and stuff like this. And then the person finally gets there and they commit suicide or they return to the street. It's just this constant circle that I don't think we notice that it's there and know how to fix it. So do you feel that bringing more awareness to that aspect, or the aspect of just getting people housed and getting them to point B? What direction do you think we should take in order to not have this continuous problem that's happening right now?
Great question. Tough to answer. A lot of different parts. Bureaucracy kills. We have to, at the core, fix housing. I think we need to be authentic about it. The homeless sector wants to say housing works, housing works. I stopped saying housing first because it has such a bad, I say housing plus support.
Yeah.
You know, if once I say housing first, people shut down. So now I try to say housing plus support because that's what they don't hear. When we say housing first, they hear homeless drug addicts getting free housing, right? So I try to change that narrative right on the title. But I mean, it's a conversation that I have with service providers. I mean, there's not enough support, you know, and there's a staffing crisis and there's a lot of issues. I'm not saying that service providers are all doing bad. Their hands are tied in many ways, and there's bureaucracy and the system sucks. And we have to, I think that's where we need to get the voice of lived experience in leadership roles, right? I don't see that changing until we're making the decisions and that we're advocating for our own, instead of just having formerly homeless people speak on a panel at a conference.
I think that kind of touches on this idea and this myth of the, you know, service resistant person as well. If somebody would be quote unquote service resistant, it probably means the services are not adequate or working properly, right? We got another question. Antonio, no more questions. It looks like we might be at one more question quickly, and then we can, you know, do another room switch.
So sort of a
Musical room.
here. I'm going to reluctantly agree with the comment, I forgot who made it earlier, that perhaps housing as a human right is not the most effective and helpful message. I simply, we're preaching to the choir here, but when we're looking to reach out among the general public, particularly up in South Florida, and you're gonna get cries of socialismo, comunista, and that immediately turns off ears, okay, and they'll be stabbed to. From the average American point of view, I would contend that a lot of people feel resentful that I worked hard all my life, damn it, to get my home, and I got my mortgage interest deduction, and why should I let some lazy homeless person sleeping on the street get a home? Okay, and I actually saw that, I actually got that comment at a presentation in Key West many years ago. A colleague of mine was there when I kept saying housing first, in response to that, the mayor was saying, well, look, we got hardworking people here who can't afford housing. Why should we give it to the homeless here? We need to give it to the people who are working and contributing to our economy. And so this is going to be the general feeling. What we did see, on the other hand, was a massive government influx of funds and getting people off the streets in response to a healthcare crisis. We also see that from the pandemic, and we also see that people are very, very much cost sensitive and sensitive to money in their pocket. And I'm contending here that perhaps those two issues are the ones that will convince people that forget the housing first type of thing. You're taking money out of your pocket through criminalization. It's a very expensive way to make homelessness worse, okay? That criminalization is actually costing far, far, far more than simply providing some permanent supportive housing for individuals. So forget the housing first. Let's look at bucks. Look at money out of your pocket. And you're spending a lot of money right now. I know in Miami are wasting $70,000 a month for this police heat unit to go through and traumatize the homeless. That's just money right down the drain, $70,000 a month. In terms of health, you're endangering public health by displacing people. We have data now to show how inpatient hospitalizations go up, overdoses go up. And that's again costing you money and lowering the public health by criminalizing homelessness. So my contention is, let's forget the housing first, because that endangers people think of a zero sum. There's only a limited amount of housing here, and give housing to somebody else is going to take it away from me and take it away from hard-working people. Let's focus on the money, and let's focus on the health implications of criminalization.
Real quick, so because I know you're running out of time, we've been playing around with criminalization messaging. If you want to go to invisiblepeople.tv/stop sweeps, you'll see our sweep video /stop invisiblepeople.tv films /films or /that, all our content. But I believe the public is willing to pay more taxes to get homeless people out of sight. I think they're perfectly fine paying more for LAPD to remove them. I think they've lost trust in us. And they're like going, oh, we tried the housing, now let's remove them. So what I've been trying to do, because I'm taking what you said a different way. So what we're trying to do is more, oh, they're still there. The Los Angeles spends $70 million a year on sweeps. So what we're doing is we're going to a sweep, we're interviewing homeless people, and we're going back 2 days later, and they're still there. So the $70 million is a waste of money. We share how it's harder to end homelessness, which costs more money and different things, but we're not sharing the direct finance. I think we have to message housing. I mean, we have to. I'm just saying housing first is a term, it needs new branding maybe, or we do a branding campaign so that people understand what it really is, because it's just so negative, but we have to continue to reinforce housing as a solution. But I've been playing around with the criminalization message because I really believe the public perfectly fine paying more taxes.
I do believe we are out of time for this conversation. I see a few more hands up, so sorry we were not able to get to your questions. Although I'm sure Mark and Pam both would be more than willing to answer your question in person if you would like to ask it. Thank you all so much. We're gonna get ready to break the rooms again and go into our third breakout sessions.